now like to introduce our speaker, Tim Loya.
Am I good? Yes, okay. First, before I get into my message, and I did warn her that I was going to do this, so don't feel bad for her, but my friend Carolyn Bradshaw drove all the way down from Round Rock when she could have just as easily seen me online today, so. All right. I'd like to start about why I felt the need to talk about politics at church, and I have 3 reasons. First, as our president Michael so eloquently stated during my new member class, we are a church of heretics. And so long as the Johnson Amendment stands, talking politics at church is pretty heretical. But more on that point, we already do talk about politics at church. Those that roll their eyes and saying that everything these days is political fail to see that everything is political, and it always has been. Choosing Coke over Pepsi is political. Choosing Apple over Android is political. Star Trek has been political since 1966, and Star Wars has been political since 1977. We live under capitalism, and the adage about voting with your dollars is absolutely correct, and every dollar you spend is implicit support of that company's policies, domestic and abroad. Second, every Sunday we recite, "The quest for truth is our sacrament." So we need to know the true definition of things and what they mean before we can even begin to peel away the layers of propaganda and misinformation we have accumulated as Americans, to have that honest conversation and seek truth. Third, my propensity to correct only those whom I care about. I am an introvert. Being up here, super uncomfortable for me. I also try to live by the philosophy that I am not responsible for the ignorance of others. But I do speak when I hear those whom I respect being wrong. And here in this church, I have often heard words that have specific meanings being used incorrectly in order to try to provoke an emotional reaction. One last note before I begin in earnest. When I first started seeking guidance and approval on speaking about politics, I was cautioned multiple times about speaking in support of any particular candidate or party. So here in front of you, I promise to not say one single positive thing about any political party or ideology. And I'm not here to support any individual. In fact, I'll do one better, and if by the end of this message, I have not insulted your favorite political party or ideology, see me during coffee and conversation. I'll be sure to do that for you. Now, I believe we have more than a few medical professionals in the congregation, some in law, in the sciences, in business, and many others that have a trade or a profession that heavily relies on your knowledge and experience. Now, I'd like you to think about all those times a random person has walked up to you to correct you about your specialty. Now imagine that your specialty is politics. I would like to read to you a quote from, slide 2. I would like to read to you a quote from scientist and author Isaac Asimov from an article he wrote in 1980. And while I won't say that he wrote it in response to a particular someone getting elected to president that year, I'm also not going to say that. There's a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti-intellectualism that has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. So the next time you hear someone saying they know more about something than an expert in the field, I would suggest asking that person if they intend to get their next proctology exam from a plumber. Slide 3. I assume everyone here has heard of political science. You wouldn't be incorrect to say that political science is the study of politics, but that's as accurate a statement as saying that physics is the study of why things happen. To be more accurate, political science, or poli-sci, is a multidisciplinary study incorporating anthropology, sociology, psychology, and utilizing the scientific method to interpret and validate political theory, philosophy, and ethics. As for the Overton window, the term is named after political scientist Dr. Joseph Overton. Slide 4. The theory states that a policy's political viability depends mainly on whether it falls within an acceptable range, rather than on a politician's ideology or the demonstrable benefits thereof. According to Overton, the window frames a range of policies that a politician can support without appearing too extreme to gain or keep public office, given the climate of public opinion at the time. One of the main criticisms of the Overton window is that it simply recreates the US political spectrum, but more on that in a moment. That is also why it tends to be demonstrated vertically as opposed to horizontally to distinguish between the two. One of the biggest strengths of the Overton window, though, is that it recognizes that what is acceptable shifts as public opinion does, though still on a one-dimensional axis. This is most easily demonstrated with the rise of the third way Democrats, which, while originally gaining traction in 1974, really came into prominence with the election of Bill Clinton to the presidency in 1992. And while taken with good faith, third way Democrats can be seen as one party showing its willingness to enter into policy formation and negotiation, the other party, being disingenuous in those efforts, has shown over the past 30 years that both parties have instead shifted rightwards towards regressivism. As one party showed its willingness to move towards the center between them, the other continued and continues to shift ever rightward while simultaneously declaring anything to the left of its own positions to be un-American, radical, and untenable, despite those same policies being accepted widely through the rest of the developed world. One of the best examples I can think of this rightward shift is utilizing a process in political science we call comparative policy analysis. This is the process by which we analyze a politician's actual supported and forwarded policies, ignoring their public comments and media statements, to place them on the political spectrum, the results of which often show us things like this. When placing Hillary Clinton candidate for president in 2016, she fell to the right of Richard Nixon. Slide 5. Many moons ago, when I was but a freshman taking one of my first 100-level poli-sci classes, as an icebreaker, our professor challenged us to come up with an item that had been invented in the US that we felt defines us as a nation. Of course, one of the first answers was apple pie, which is wrong, even though the saying says so, because the apple pie is Dutch. There were a few other answers, nothing that really stands out in my mind, but of course I remember my own answer, the halogen headlight. I was correct, it was invented in the US. And when I asked why I felt it represented the nation, I had one of those moments of clarity where you know just the right thing to say at the exact right moment. The reason I felt and still believe that the halogen headlight is the invention that represents our nation is because I can't think of anything more American than a device that blinds everyone headed in the opposite direction just so that you can see where you're going more clearly. I, like I believe many of us, grew up being taught that the political spectrum looks something like this. Slide 6. If we got more involved in or aware of politics through activism or interest or education, we may even have had our view of the political spectrum expand to something like this. Slide 7. People that insist on the one-dimensional political spectrum are like people that insist phrenology is real. For those unaware or forgetting, phrenology was the study of the shape of a person's skull and claimed to be able to determine someone's intelligence, character, and morality. They're both hugely inaccurate, claim to measure things they can't possibly measure, and the person pushing it is likely doing so because they have an agenda. As it shouldn't be new to anyone, systems exist to perpetuate themselves. And so it serves the American system that we think the political spectrum exists on such a plane, with our ideals at its very center. However, such a view is not just wrong, it is both arrogant and sophomoric. Slide 8. Americans tend to think they're special, and by extension, we think everything about our system is special. Despite our distance from the top position in almost every measurable positive metric of value, we are not anywhere near the top in either social or medical outcomes for our population. Our educational outcomes are slipping, especially in terms of in-field employment after graduation from college. And even despite the egregious amounts we invest into it, our military superiority is beginning to be legitimately questioned worldwide. This assumption of superiority, despite so much evidence to the contrary, is called American exceptionalism, and it has hampered our ability to progress and adapt to the changing circumstances of the world. But there is one area in which we are most definitely special: politics. Just not for the reason that most people assume or ascribe to. We are the only Western liberal-style democracy that has only two serious parties, and we are the only Western liberal-style democracy in which all our political parties are conservative parties. The most commonly accepted visual representation of the political spectrum looks something like this. Slide 9. Side note, when I was first taught this spectrum, the authoritarian, anti-authoritarian sides were actually reversed, but this is the most common usage now. It will become important in a few minutes. Pay attention to the words, not the locations. The strength of this spectrum is that it separates and thus allows for display the difference between where an ideology lies between the individualist and collectivist effects it would have, and the force and authority that a government has to enforce that ideology. And if we overlay the positions from the expanded one-dimensional spectrum, it becomes very apparent just how ridiculous the one-dimensional spectrum is. Slide 11. Now, this next point may seem strange to hear from someone who, most of the time, does little more than read and write for a living, but I despise the thesaurus. Words mean things, and the English language is imprecise enough as it is. The example of literal and figurative comes to mind, with completely opposite meanings, and yet the thesaurus says they are one and the same. We'll start with the easy, least controversial point, slide 12. Moderates and centrists are not the same thing. In fact, a centrist would be to the left of the Democratic Party. You see, a moderate holds a position between 2 points and often engages in false equivalency, and a centrist holds a position at or near the center of all points. So while it is true that a moderate holds a position between 2 points offered by her own limited political system, that places them nowhere near the center. Ironically enough, Bernie Sanders and AOC, utilizing comparative policy analysis, both actually qualify as centrists, not even breaching the center line between individualism and collectivism. AOC is a little to the right of the line, actually, and Bernie a few more blocks towards anti-authoritarianism than the Democratic Party. Now, I would like to read an excerpt from a concerned citizen to their senator. I believe that every citizen is entitled to know the policy of the government, and I am so confused that I wish you would write me and advise me whether it is the policy of this administration, of which you are a very important part, to further discourage business enterprise and eventually set up a program which eliminates private industry and effort and replaces it with government control of industry and labor. Call it what you will, socialism or communism or by any other name. Letter to U.S. Senator Wagner, in response to FDR's new policy deals 1934. Socialism has long been used as a boogeyman by those who oppose progressive economic and social policies. And communism has long been used as synonymous with socialism. And I can't say the two are entirely distinct, but much like how every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square, all communism is socialism, but not all socialism is communism. How many of you have heard someone tell you or shared a meme with you about how socialism is where the government tells you what to do? I would ask you to immediately begin to ignore and disregard any further political commentary from that source. If they lack the basic understanding that one of the basic functions of every government is telling you what to do, they're called laws, then that person is not a good source of political commentary. Slide 13. If you want to dislike socialism, I'm not going to try and convince you otherwise, but dislike socialism for its own merits and faults, not because some talking head with a soothing voice and a reputation for telling you exactly what you want to hear says about it. The biggest problem is that socialism and communism are both economic theories, not governmental models, and so do not even belong on our political spectrum. So instead, let's change the socialism flag to that of the European Union, the largest and most successful government adopting the widest array of socialist economic policies in the world that also happens to be a democracy. Slide 14. Slide 15. And as for communism, let's go straight to the root of almost all bias, and perhaps rightfully so, and call it the Soviet Union. Slide 16. The biggest problem there being that the Soviets were never communist economically. Much like China is not communist today. For an accurate representation of communism, I would point you towards the hippie communes of the 60s and 70s. The hint is in the name. Both the Soviet Union and China are statist, authoritarian regimes. Plus, if you don't know the origin of the word Soviet, you probably don't know the USSR was also a democracy, just a highly flawed one with pre-decided elections, much like the capitalist Russian Federation today, or many of our own states with gerrymandered districts. And now, let us talk a little bit about fascism and Nazism. These are two distinct points on the political spectrum, but are often used interchangeably with authoritarianism, which is an entire half of the spectrum. None of them mean the same thing. Those that study fascism have gone so far as to create a checklist of what defines a fascist state. And I believe it is important so that we can delineate between simple authoritarianism and actual fascism. I would also like to take a moment to highlight a growing movement on the right being called Red Caesarism, calling for all the same things as fascism, but rebranding it, much like a tech bro reinventing the subway and hoping we don't notice it's just a subway. To be clear, Red Caesarism is just fascism with a makeover. And then we'll move on to Nazism. While Nazism and fascism share many of the same attributes, especially the rejection of liberalism, socialism, and communism, there are some highly overt differences. Fascism believes that the state is the ultimate primacy, while Nazism believes that race is the ultimate primacy. Fascism depends on a highly rigid social class structure, while Nazism tries to eliminate social classes for racial unity. This is why Nazism is more towards collectivism than individualism. So when someone says Nazis are from the left, they're kind of right. It depends on what that person's political point of origin is. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about crying wolf. While there is definitely no one to blame other than those who voted for Trump and then enabled him, that we came so close to an American fascism, I believe the warning of the general public was far more difficult than it had to be due to political leftists misusing the word fascist for the better part of 6 decades. The wolf was actually coming for our nation, and no one believed it was happening because all the other times the cry was sounded and there was no wolf. Now, if you had trouble grasping that political spectrum was more than one dimension, I have bad news for you, because there is a growing support for splitting the conservative progressive axis and the individual collectivist axis, thus making the spectrum 3-dimensional. Slide 18. I believe one of the biggest cases for this is the curious case of the rural conservative. They are very obviously not progressive, and yet live very collectivist, one might even say socialist lifestyles. Just don't tell them that. Sharing resources with their neighbors, often without question, and a farming co-op is very much a socialist construct, and one that has been part of rural America for hundreds of years. Lastly, I would like to talk about the National Intelligence Council and their latest report and findings. Slide 19. This is publicly available, and you can download it and read it at your leisure. For those that don't know, the National Intelligence Council is an organization that utilizes resources from within the intelligence community and then bridges the gap to experts in various fields in academia and private industry to develop a predictive plan as to the challenges the U.S. and the world will be facing in the next 15 to 20-year window. The NIC's goal is to provide policymakers with the best available information that is unvarnished, unbiased, and without regard to whether their analytical judgments conform to current U.S. policy. They have identified a laundry list of growing crises, and I apologize, but it is a long one. Stalled progress on combating infectious diseases, growing antimicrobial resistance, rising levels of non-communicable diseases, increasing strains on mental health, especially among youth, growing income inequality despite the growth of the global middle class, increasing migration, increased demand for international development and humanitarian organizations despite stagnating funding, climate change, environmental degradation, growing power among multinational corporations, international trade fragmentation, rising national debts, evolution of global competitiveness, disruptive technologies, information insecurity, and social fragmentation. Any one of these things represents a challenge to the stability of any society, but all of them happening simultaneously create multiple crises that have completely ignored national boundaries. But not to worry too much, as the NIC has come up with not just one, but 2 solutions, or at least the beginnings of solutions. Our system needs to change in one of 2 directions. If we want all the trappings of capitalism to stay where they are, we have no choice but to move towards being a more authoritarian state, to force the population to adhere to state mandates and control dissension from those that refuse to conform. The NIC also cautions against this solution, as they see it as short-term, and even predict the failure of several existing authoritarian states dealing with these same problems, the lack of adaptability being their prime concern. If we want to keep the same level of personal autonomy, though, they suggest moving towards a more collectivist organization and societal paradigm shift. This includes a concept they refer to as adaptive governance, empowering NGOs and other non-state organizations to provide a wider range of services with overlapping areas of influence and even governance, as well as an increase of the power and responsibilities of local governments that can see and address issues as they occur without relying on archaic and lumbering bureaucracies. Ultimately, though, they warn that change is coming, one way or another, And I think we've all seen the beginnings of that over the last 5 years. In conclusion, slide 20. I urge you to open up that Overton window because the whole wide rest of the world exists. Solutions some people are we face. I would argue that the challenges themselves are radical. To expand upon the great Mark Twain sentiments, possibly misattributed to the man, I would say that our ideologies and political parties should be treated the same way he feels we should treat those whom we elect. Politicians are a lot like diapers. They should be changed frequently and for the same reason. Thank you.